Hello and welcome to India's World. Michael Flynn, who had been appointed National Security Advisor by US President Donald Trump, resigned on February 13th, barely 1 month into his new job. Flynn was forced to resign for misleading Vice President Mike Pence about his telephonic conversations with Russian Ambassador to the US, Sergei Kislyak, before Trump took over as president. He had apparently discussed US sanctions on Russia for interfering in US presidential election with the ambassador. Michael Flynn had apparently advised Russia not to react harshly as the sanctions were likely to be reviewed once Trump took over. However, he told Vice President Pence that he had not discussed the sanctions with the Russian ambassador. Pence had later appeared on television and defended this. The question that is being asked in this context is Michael Flynn's exit part of the Trump-Russia narrative which aims to project the president as someone who won his election with Russian covert help and who is therefore soft on Moscow? And if that is the case, the next question is Trump being attacked by the so-called deep state which wants to condition and mold his foreign policy, especially towards Russia? To discuss these questions and more, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, a former Foreign Secretary of India. He has served as India's ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France and Russia. We have with us Ambassador Meera Shankar. She was India's ambassador to the United States. And we also have with us Mr. Nandan Unnikrishnan. He is a Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Earlier, he was the Moscow Bureau Chief of the Press Trust of India. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. Do you think that this Michael Flynn episode and the leaks about Russian contacts of the Trump campaign before Trump got elected are indications that the US intelligence community will not let relations with Russia improve even a little bit? Is President Trump the target or is the target US-Russia relations?
In a sense, both. Because this has become a huge issue in the United States, which is being exaggerated by the Democratic Party, the intelligence agencies, the think tanks, all the cold warriors who have invested their careers in the Cold War against Russia and don't want to see an improvement, a real improvement of US-Russia ties, because then their importance within the system and their role within the system gets diluted. And there is the arms lobby, which is also involved in this. They want to keep the tensions alive, and there are larger geopolitical reasons, because once the relations begin to improve, then NATO gets weakened. And therefore, US hold over NATO, or the Europe gets weakened. So there are a lot of geopolitical consequences of all this. So there is this personal bitterness of the fact that Trump won, and also a larger geopolitical view of these people that improving ties with Russia would actually reduce their salience within the system.
Meera, there is of course this theory about the deep state doing all this, the intelligence agencies doing all this. But could there be a simpler explanation, which is that the intelligence agencies may be concerned that Flynn, by lying to the Vice President, had become vulnerable to blackmail by the Russians and could be blackmailed at a future date?
Well, that's one of the reasons being cited. But if you look, then, mending relations with Russia has been one of the platforms that President Trump has been elected on. And in the US, any policy which has been so entrenched for so long needs to be, the ground, if there is to be a U-turn or a significant change, then the ground needs to be prepared. But I think President Trump has moved rather precipitously. So you can see that there's been an effort to create tripwires to hem him in. First, with the news that the Russians had hacked the Democratic Party emails during the election and sought to interfere in the elections, on the basis of which President Obama had expelled certain Russians diplomats
and imposed sanctions.
Imposed sanctions. The second, the news that President Trump might have been personally compromised when he visited Russia as a businessman, and that is why he was proposing this change in policy. And now, of course, the Michael Flynn episode. So clearly, there are elements and institutions within the US who would like to perhaps hem in President Trump in terms of acting on his avowed electoral platform vis-a-vis Russia.
Nandan, why do you think Trump took such a reconciliatory approach towards Russia if the country wasn't ready, if the institutions of the country weren't ready? Did he not know that this would put him at odds with, of course, the Democratic opposition, certainly, but also influential Republicans and the intelligence community?
You know, Trump started by defeating the Republican Party first. So that he would alienate influential Republicans was something he was aware of. Subsequently, he also defeated the Democratic Party. So in a sense, as Mr. Sibal pointed out, it was a defeat for the establishment. And as far as his policy is concerned, I think there is a very minuscule minority in the US foreign policy community, and maybe some of them are influencing him also, which tend to view the world a little bit more realistically, let's say, not from a liberal interventionist kind of platform where they want to build the world in America's image, but from a realistic view that China is probably a greater threat to the United States, and that Russia, as Obama had once himself said, is a declining power, and yes, it is a superpower in the sense that it has nuclear weapons and capable of destroying the United States, but on the world stage it has limited ability to act, and that it's China that has to be, China's rise that has to be managed in a more appropriate manner. So I think this happened, and I would completely agree with Ambassador Shankar that these tripwires and hemming in is all being created so as not to allow him to go too far.
Okay. Does the hysteria over Russian influence on the Trump campaign, the contacts with the Russians, after all, what had Michael Flynn done? He had not formulated policy. He was merely saying, he was a foreign policy advisor to Trump, he was merely saying, don't overreact, don't get hysterical. And what would they catch him for? Logan Act. It's like, you can't get somebody for murder, you arrest him for traffic violations. So is the evidence that is available in the public domain commensurate with the hysteria that is there in America?
Of course, looking at it from externally, it seems to me that the whole political system in the United States has become so immature, and it hardly behoves a country which prides itself for its democracy to behave in this immature manner. All ambassadors in Washington, I can tell you from my personal experience, when there is a transition in a new administration, they quickly want to be able to reach out to the advisors, to the people they think are going to hold positions, and talk to them, talk about their own affairs and what they would like to see happen between them and the United States, or size up the views of the new people, this and that. So it was perfectly normal for the Russian ambassador to try and reach out to Michael Flynn and for the two to talk to each other. And if this law was going to be invoked, then I think 3/4 of the Washington establishment would be behind bars, etc., etc.
So there is a certain bloody-mindedness in
Absolutely, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, the issue is, as you said in your opening remarks, that Flynn did not reveal the entire truth to Pence, and hence there was embarrassment. And Trump himself has said that he's been sacked not because he did anything wrong. In fact, he defended his conversation with the Russian ambassador, but that he was less than honest with Mike Pence.
So he was aware of the Logan Act then?
Well, Logan Act, nobody has been convicted in the United States since 1790 under this act.
Well, he's also not been convicted, he's been punished sufficiently.
No, punished even. And as I said, that this is normal way that diplomacy functions, or diplomats function in Washington.
Okay, we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing whether a reset of US-Russia ties is possible under President Donald Trump. Mr. Shankar, why hasn't Trump been able to get full control over the intelligence agencies, and why has he not been able to fix responsibility for these leaks and stem them? Because if he's not able to do so quickly, is it not possible that such selective leaks will continue? After all, the leaks have come deliberately from the intelligence agencies, which should be under the president's control.
Well, this is a time-honored Washington tradition, because there are different agencies and each has a different agenda, and in that cauldron of policy making, where all different portions from different agencies and institutions are poured in, and each pursues its own agenda, sometimes at the cost of the others, this is a time-honored Washington tradition that they leak. But so early in a president's term, perhaps this is happening for the first time. I think if you take a look at the other point at which the US made a seminal shift in foreign policy strategy, it was handled very secretly. Nixon and Kissinger, when they went to China, in fact, when Kissinger went to China, nobody even knew that he had gone. And all the preliminary steps that, waltz of coinciding steps which would be required to lead up to the opening of relations with China were charted out in full secrecy. And then I think the ground was prepared for Nixon's visit to China. I don't know if President Trump will be able to retrieve the policy ground that he has lost or the manner in which he has hedged in. But it will also depend on how he handles his domestic agenda, because he started with the ban on Muslim immigration and ban on the refugees, and that itself domestically roiled public opinion within the United States. So if he moves towards a more centrist position in some of these issues, a more pragmatic position without abandoning his platform, he'll find it easy. But if he wants to go straight just on his kind of electoral platform without taking in other shades of opinion which were very large, then I think you're going to see the US have a lot of domestic conflict over policy issues, including foreign policy.
All right. Nandan, who benefits from preventing an improvement in US-Russia ties? Do you agree with those who claim that it is the military-industrial complex which benefits, and because they would want either an actual conflict with Russia or a virtual conflict so that their profitability is maintained? Or do you think that is too much of a conspiracy theory, too pat an explanation?
Actually, it's a question to which I do not have an answer, because if you look at the interests of the United States and you look at the stage in which the world is today, I would not by any stretch of imagination classify the Russians as the primary threat to the United States. The second thing is that if you want to manage China's rise, you have to ensure that China and Russia are not in a tight embrace, where...
No, you made that point. I'm merely saying, for example, in West Asia, if Russia and America are on the opposing sides, that conflict can continue. And it is that conflict which benefits the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, but it benefits the military-industrial complex only in a very limited manner. I mean, you're smelling small arms and all. It's not as if you're supplying, aircraft or heavy different complex platforms. So I don't see the military-industrial, but yes, it does help the military-industrial complex whenever the discussion on their budget comes in front of the Senate, because yes, Russia is an existential threat. It can destroy the United States. But more than that, it is interesting to note how, this whole case has been built. And what is completely ignored is that if the Russians actually zeroed in on Trump as their agent, they would have done a serious study of Mr. Trump, and they would have come to the conclusion that he is psychologically unstable, and they wouldn't touch him with a barge pole.
But they might want a psychologically unstable person leading the US. But I really don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. Let me ask you something else, Ambassador Sibal. Will Trump now be, because of all this public pressure and what the media is doing to him, and I personally, as a media person, feel that some of his criticism is right, because all these stories that have come out are completely unsourced. Who are these people who are alarmed? Who are the sources? No sources, no denials, but creation of an alarm. But never mind that. Will he now be forced under pressure to overcompensate by making hard statements about Russia to show that he is not indebted to Moscow in any way? And isn't this already happening? His tweet about Crimea, his Secretary of State saying that there's no question of military cooperation ever with these people, that the Russians don't follow international laws, etc. So suddenly you find negative statements coming out of the Trump administration.
Actually, if you watch Russian television and the statements that are coming from there, you would find that there is a kind of a reevaluation going on about what Trump may mean for US-Russia relationship. They were never that sanguine, but yes, they favored him over Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton was a known entity, anti-Russian, whereas Trump during the campaign was making, I think, sensible noises about improving ties and cooperating with them to deal with the Islamic State. But they have noted that there is a change in tone in Washington now, whether it's tactical in order to diffuse all the opposition that is getting built up and to strengthen their hands in order to move forward on a limited basis with Russia, because they can't go the whole hog, neither do they want to. But this might actually help them to reach out, because they would have tried to diffuse the anti-Russian paranoia that is being built up. But at the end of the day, I think that Trump, Tillerson, and people like that are conscious of the fact of two things. One, that they should improve ties with Russia in a manageable way, politically manageable way, and that in the process, they want to de-link Russia and China to the extent that this is possible. And the Russians are conscious of it, and they have begun talking about this, that this seems to be the American aim. And they are saying that they are not going to fall into this trap because they can't rely on the American political system and on Trump, and that they would unnecessarily be falling into a trap if an American trap, if the price for Russia to normalize relations with the United States would be to de-link itself from China.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the possibility of resetting US-Russia ties by President Donald Trump. Ambassador Shankar, you've heard what Ambassador Sibal said about what the Russians think. But do you think the Russian expectations were always low right from the beginning, knowing that Trump was up against very powerful forces if he tried to improve ties with Moscow? So has Kremlin been more realistic throughout?
Yes, I think if you look at the statements that have been made even after Trump's election, then Russia, while welcoming his election and his intention to improve relations with Russia and reduce tensions, has also said, to the extent that he is able to, in a sense. They understood that it's going to be not overnight, it's something which is slow, because given the entrenched animosities within the system, that it is going to take time. Now, geopolitically, it makes sense, because, if China is seen as the long-term, rival, economic and political rival to the US, then like Nixon weaning away China in that strategic triangular balance with the Soviet Union, which made, tilted the balance of power very decisively in favor of the US, would be, part of that triangular relationship and would weigh the triangle even more in favor of the US. So strategically it makes sense. But then there are other issues, the domestic opinion within the US, how far is it ready? How far are the allies ready? In Europe, it would be the new East European countries, which have a very strong anti-Russian position. And then in the Middle East, the Arab allies of the US, who have a strong anti-Assad platform. So these are the complicating factors in terms of making that policy. I see that if they persist, there could be limited areas of cooperation.
Let me take that to a simple question to you, Nandan. Do you think Trump would be able to lift sanctions on Russia, even if he wants to?
You have to see that there are three types of sanctions.
Yeah.
So
Crimea, Ukraine, and
so the question is that some of these sanctions are possible, like returning some of the resorts that the Russian diplomats used near New York is surely doable. Lifting sanctions which were imposed because of Crimea would be very difficult, because but there is a way to finesse that too. Because the United States, for example, never recognized the Baltics as part of Russia or the Soviet Union. But yet, while the US ambassador or US officials never visited that part of the world, they did business with Moscow. So there are ways of getting around this. I would tend to agree with Ambassador Shankar that there is very limited scope because, for example, a joint operation in Syria, which what everyone is talking about, is hardly possible because at the end of the day, if you do a joint operation in Syria, you're actually aligning yourself with the Iranians who are on the ground. See, and that is something that is impossible for Trump to do at this point of time. So I see very limited scope of any kind of cooperation. And final point is, I do not think the Russians are ready to abandon, and I completely agree with Ambassador Sibal, the Russians are not ready to abandon China for a pie in the sky. Okay. So you'll have to really flesh out something.
Okay. Now, within the US, Ambassador Sibal, the Senate Intelligence Committee has said that it will deepen the ongoing probe to include NSA or former NSA Michael Flynn's actions. Could this investigation also come in the way of any plans that Trump might have of trying to improve ties? Because he'll be pulled down constantly by this investigation.
No, it's very clear that the whole game is to put as many hurdles in the way of President Trump to improve ties with Russia, although logic and common sense and geopolitical considerations would demand that. So it is a mystery. But as to why they're going so far when the reality is that Russia does not pose a threat to the United States. Russia doesn't even pose a threat to Europe. But the feelings in Europe, apart from the Baltic states and the Poland, countries like Poland, who incidentally exert a lot of influence in American policy making towards Russia, but even major countries like UK and France, they are at the governmental level, Hollande for instance, they are very anti-Russian, and they are very traumatized from their point of view of what Russia has done in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, etc., etc. So there are a lot of difficulties in the way of Trump wanting to do what he wants to do, though he has been rather obdurate even during the campaign in wanting to improve ties with Russia. But the hurdles are being created, and all this is being done, as you rightly said, in order to make it increasingly difficult for him to move forward with Russia. Yes.
Ambassador Shankar, within the US, I was talking, Senate investigation is going on, but there is already other moves being made. There is a Senate sanctions oversight resolution called the Russia Review Act, which has been introduced, gives congressional members oversight over whether to maintain or lift sanctions, preventing unilateral action by the president. It requires the White House to submit a report explaining why it seeks sanctions removal and a 120-day review period following that. And this is in addition to earlier legislation which has been introduced called the Countering Russian Hostilities Act of 2017. So forget Europe. You have within US Congress people who are trying to make sure that you do nothing that would lead to a rapprochement with Russia.
Well, that has traditionally been the position of quite a few of the Republican right, you know, and John McCain, Lindsey Graham, many of these people are also involved in these initiatives. So there is, as I said, a strong body of opinion which resists this opening to Russia and sees Putin as having, you know, aggrandized at the cost of the US in the Ukraine, in Syria and so on. But if you look at what happened in the past, you know, Russia and the US were able to have the follow-on agreement to start under President Obama. The second is that they were able to cooperate on the nuclear deal with Iran, because Russia was very much, and China were very much part of that group, along with the US and Europe and so on, and UK and France, which negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran. So, and earlier you've seen limited cooperation also when Russia made available the northern route for US supplies to Afghanistan.
That's all in the past. My question now...
So what I'm saying is that even if you had not such a, you know, strong resistance, there have been instances, I'm saying even when there was resistance, there have been instances
Okay,
of
so now we've run out of time. Just want a yes or no answer from all of you. Do you think Trump will triumph over his political foes and be able to do whatever he wants to do? Because these are early days. He will learn as he goes along. So yes or no?
I think he will, but in a more sophisticated manner.
Yeah.
And the opposition to what he wants to change is visible not only with Trump. Lavrov and Kerry had hammered an agreement on Syria, where it was sabotaged in Washington.
Yeah.
It wasn't sabotaged
Okay,
anywhere
yes
else.
or no? Just yes or no, because we really don't have time.
in a more nuanced way.
Okay.
I think, as you rightly said, it's early days. He still has almost 4 years to go.
Yeah.
And I can't see, for logical and empirical reasons, that the situation with Russia will become worse. It doesn't serve US interest or Russia's interest. So some kind of a modus vivendi, but it will be slow in the making.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry about this yes and no business, but we seem to get better answers with yes and no than with complicated questions. I'd like to thank all of you, Nandan, Unnikrishnan, Ambassador Meera, Shankar, Ambassador Kanwal, Sibal, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again as usual next week. Until then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.